a short video on company formation and business structures about what we're covering on the module and what our expectations are about that you'll know about this. Okay, so I thought the place I would start is what are the things you have to think about when you're launching a business venture which are relevant to what business structure you choose. So we talked about this in the lecture, and these things are taken largely from our discussion around there. So what sort of skills do you have? Not in terms of, can you paint or decorate or whatever, but what sort of skills do you have in terms of running the business? Are you good at cash flows? Are you good at using Excel? Do you understand about getting money? What are the skills that you have that you need to run a business? Will you want to be working with other people, or is it something that you'll be engaged on your own? Is it a big enterprise, a small enterprise? Have you got ambition to spread far and wide across the globe, or is it something you'll just be doing locally? Where are you going to get your money from? Have you got a friendly friend who's got a lot of cash who's going to pour that into your business, or are you going to have to try and borrow on the open market? What sort of scale of business? Is this a big turnover with a small margin, or is this small bespoke products with a high margin? I mean, what is the turnover of this business intended to be? Are you laying yourself open to huge financial risk, or is it relatively low capital, low infrastructure? Is it something that you can do without risking racking up huge lots of debt? How will you be taxed? Will you be taxed as an individual? Will you be taxed as a business? What are the business taxes? What's the national insurance rates you have to pay? What are the financial side of that in terms of the inland revenue and the Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs? How much hassle is it to set up? How much formality is it to go for one business structure over another? And is there anything you have to comply with legally if you choose one rather than another? Are you worried about having to publish your accounts? Do you want to keep it all quiet, or are you happy that it all can be transparent and it has to be reported to Companies House? So these are the sort of issues that need to be at the back of your mind as you're considering which business structure to choose. And I must say, when you go on to choose a business structure and talk about this, don't think it's all black and white. There are similarities between each, and the boundaries in recent times between all of the options that we're going to look at have been somewhat blurred. So it's not a completely clear-cut question. Now, before we get on to what the business structures are, let's just say a thing or two about legal personalities. You and I, when we're born, are not just people, human beings, we are also legal personalities. So we exist as an individual in the lives of the law as soon as we draw breath on our own. And that's an important concept when it comes to running a business. An actual human being. Now, you can create artificial personalities. So I've represented those by a robot here. They are separately created companies in this instance, and they have a legal personality just like you and I do. So the law would view them equally as personalities. You, flesh and blood, and then this one that's set up by a process of law. Don't call it a robot, obviously, because it's not a robot. It's a separate, artificially created legal personality, and that's the point I want to make. And we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the corporate veil and that the significance of creating separate legal personalities. So what are the basic options of which you need to be aware? You could be a sole trader, represented by this one figure here. A sole trader is the simplest business structure, and if you're doing anything in business and you haven't thought about it, that's what you are. You are simply a legal personality who is a person who is conducting business. And that's the simplest business structure and the basic one from which you need to begin. You can, if there's more than one of you, set up in partnership. Now, although partners for us implies two people, it can be any number of partners. So a partnership doesn't have a separate legal liability, a legal personality rather. It's just like the sole trader. It's a group of individuals with legal personality in an agreement to run a business for profit. There's a third legal structure which is halfway between a partnership and a company, and this has, as you can see from the robot floating above these three figures, it has a separate legal personality. So the law creates for an LLP partnership limited liability partnership, it creates a separate legal personality that exists apart from the human beings in the partnership. And then the final option that you need to be aware of can be divided into two. You can be a company with a completely separate personality, and you can be either private or public. Now, in that situation, the artificially created personality is the thing that the law looks at. It doesn't look behind the artificially created structure to look for the individual. It deals with the company as the legal personality. As you can see from those arrows, you can be a public limited company or a private limited company, and those are the 4 or 5, depending on how you split the public and private limited company, business structures of which you need to be aware. There are more, and there are more mentioned in the CIMA textbook, but these are the ones that we expect you to know about. So a little bit more detail then. A sole trader, as I say, is just the human being who is trading on their own. No separate legal personality, and they are solely responsible for the business enterprise. Now, on the plus side, all the profit is theirs. On the downside, all the risk is theirs as well. Because there is no separate legal personality, apart from the sole trader, any business debts that are run up, the individual trading as a sole trader is personally liable for them. So if you, in your business, so this Buddy's barber shop here, if that invests a huge amount in chairs and equipment, and they then can't afford to pay for them, the barber themselves, the person who is the barber, can be pursued for every penny they have. So if they own a house, that can be repossessed to pay the debts of the sole trading business, because they are the business. Business is them. Of course, this gives you great flexibility. You don't have to answer to anybody. Your accounts are completely private. You, for tax purposes, are self-employed. Obviously, you may want to employ an accountant to kind of make sure you have the most advantageous tax arrangements. You need to keep account of what you've spent and need to know what's tax deductible. Just because it's called a sole trader, though, do note that it doesn't mean you have to work on your own. You can clearly employ people, but obviously as businesses get bigger, people tend to like to move into slightly more formal business structure where the risk is to their personal assets is diminished. So that's the simplest business structure you need to be aware of: sole tradership, no separate legal personality. Now, partnership, again, although the picture is 2 people, it can be more than 2 people. This is individuals who are working together with a view to profit. That's the simplest definition of it. You don't have to have a formal agreement. Again, like we saw in contract law, the law takes quite a relaxed view on this. If with a friend or 2 or 3 friends you decide to run a festival or some sort of event with a view to earning money, you are, according to the law, a partnership. Again, this has no separate legal personality, which is good and bad. It means that you are flexible, you can take all the decisions between you, but you do, on the downside, share all the risk. There is no limitation to the liability in a partnership. And what's more, it's more complicated in the sole tradership, because if you're in partnership, you are jointly and individually, severally that is, liable for all of the debts that are run up. So if your partner goes off as part of this venture and spends money, you are liable to pay that just as much as they are in a partnership. These, as I say, these are these 2, but there is no great formality, although obviously if you're going to be involved in a venture which is seeing a lot of money changing hands and a lot of risk attached to it, you probably will want some sort of basic agreement about how the money's going to be divided, what happens if you disagree, etc., etc. So a partnership agreement is sensible but not legally required. Trust makes it very much easier to work in partnership, and I say in a way that's important because everyone in the partnership is bound by the decisions of everyone else. Now, in the picture there, I've put a little spider's web because if you don't organise the terms of your own partnership, you are governed by an ancient act. The 1890 Partnership Act will govern the basic arrangements if you haven't written anything different down. It's a bit like contract law. There is a framework there that's there whether you know about it or not, and if you don't put anything else in place, that is what will govern your arrangements. Okay, so what about companies? Krispy Kreme is an example of a private limited company. And I'm going to go through the characteristics of a private limited company, then we're going to look at a public limited company. These are ones where a separate legal personality has been set up. And the first thing you notice is in the name, it must end, if it is a limited company, it must end in limited or LTD, because people must know that its liability for its debts are limited to its own assets. So a private limited company, when you're dealing with them, even though you might deal with Mr. X or Miss Y, you are dealing with the company, and it's their money and their assets that are at risk, and the limited company gives you a heads up to that from the minute you read about them. There's no limited on the share capital required for a private limited company. You can have one share, and that can be owned by the sole director. So actually, since they've reduced the formality of setting up limited companies, these have become much more flexible, much easier to set up, and they're not the great complicated formal affairs that you might in your head think. So a limited company can be set up relatively easily. If you're a private limited company, you're not allowed to list or advertise your shares for sale. You can have, as I say, just the one director. So if you're a sole trader running a big-ish concern, it's a relatively small task to turn yourself into a limited company, and it doesn't mean you have to get lots more people involved. You can be the company director and you can be the company shareholder. So when you write about these things, you should be aware that the boundaries between them are not black and white. It's all a bit blurred. And because you're a limited company, you don't need a company secretary, and if you do have one, they don't need to be qualified in any formal, don't need an accountant or a lawyer or anything. You don't need to hold an annual general meeting if you're a private limited company, and you can pass written resolutions. So there's no need to meet face to face if you do have a number of shareholders in order to take a decision. It all can be done with writing. So a private limited company is a relatively flexible structure compared with what you might think. It has a separate legal personality which limits the liability of the people behind the company. And as I say, you can have just one director, you don't need a company secretary, so one person can be a private limited company. So a public limited company, and ASOS is an example of one of those. Again, you get the clue from its name. It must end in PLC. Anything ending in PLC is a public limited company. Now, in order to set one of these up, you must have at least £50,000 of allotted share capital. So they are for bigger enterprises than the private limited company. So if you are faced with a problem situation, such as the one we looked at in the lecture, where you've got an individual who's thinking, shall I be a sole trader, or shall I set a private limited company? They're similar options in terms of business structures that are available and sensible for a small business, but a public limited company has to be a much bigger affair because of the formality and regulations around it. You don't have to put your shares on the stock exchange, but you may list and advertise them. You need at least 2 directors if it's a public limited company, and you do need to have a company secretary. You must have an annual general meeting, and you can't have written resolutions. So the meeting where members, the shareholders meet, has to be the way in which decisions are taken face to face. So you can see there's a lot more formality, a lot more process about a public limited company. It's a bigger affair, and therefore more formality and more process around it. And again, I want to emphasise that not everything is clear cut. You can know much more about those business structures that I've talked about, and obviously if you want to do some research on that, be great. But I want to make the point, some general points about moving between an understanding of them. We've talked a number of times about the Companies Act in 2006, and broadly the point of that was to consolidate lots of legislation and to make it easier to set up a limited company with less process and formality. So that's blurred the boundaries, as I've said, between some structures, and you'll find private limited company and limited liability partnership and sole tradership are all much closer than they used to be in terms of formality and process. Corporations and individuals do have different tax arrangements, but actually, if you're talking about that, it's difficult to be precise because the rules around it change every budget. But broadly, corporations pay corporation tax, and they have to pay, the individuals who own the shares have to pay tax, individual tax on their dividend. So working out which is the best arrangement is quite a complex process, something you may well choose to get into if you become a tax accountant. But individuals, sole traders, partners are taxed as individuals, self-employed people, whereas in companies the tax arrangements are different. So it's important to know a basic outline of each structure and how they relate to those lists of things we saw at the beginning about privacy, about formality, about liability. And business structures are not mutually exclusive. So we'll see just now, you can have a combination of things. So if you think PwC, actually, the name PwC attaches to a number of different business structures because it's a private company, limited by guarantee, which pulls together hundreds of limited liability partnerships. So the umbrella organisation is a private limited company, but then beneath that you'll find, having the same name, PwC, a lot of limited liability partnerships. So a limited liability partnership, just to say a little bit more about that, the liability of the partners is limited to the capital they put into the partnership. So they're not without liability, like in a company where the company holds all the debts because it's a separate legal personality. In a limited liability partnership, they, as a partner, commit a certain amount of capital and they are liable for the whole of that, but not any more of their personal assets. Partners, who are actually known as members, can share out the profits of the business as they choose, and they pay personal rather than corporation tax. So here's a picture of the PwC framework. That's the private limited company at the top, limited by guarantee. And they do all the kind of advertising, formal arrangements and administration of the PwC network. Then beneath it, you've got, pretty much geographically based, a series of limited liability partnerships. And these all, in these, the partners, and there are hundreds of them, pay their individual tax as self-employed people. So it's a complex business structure made up essentially of two of the basic ones we've talked about, private company and a limited liability partnerships underneath it. You can find out about a business, so if you're interested in a business, see what it is. It might not automatically be obvious to you, but you can see if they're a company by checking with Companies House, and the website's there. You can have a look at the basic nature of the business and how it's been registered and who its directors are and so on. So do have a look at that if you're interested in finding out a bit more. What I just want to talk about now is a little bit more about this idea of the separate legal personality, which is known, and you'll see it in the books, written about as the corporate veil. So here's a man as a sole trader making and selling shoes, a chap called Sal. He decides that he's expanding and he wants to set up the business as a limited company. So he sets up a separate legal personality, Sal's Shoes, and actually he's doing the same thing as he was doing before, but he's now created a legal personality. He's divided into £20,000 shares, £10,000 cash, and a £10,000 loan makes up the business funding. So £20,000 of shares, £10,000 of his own personal cash, and then he's got a loan of £10,000. And he owns the shares, more or less all of the shares. He gave the cash and he's taken out a loan. The only other shareholders are his family, who have a share each. There we are. The loan is a type of loan called a debenture, and that is money he's borrowed effectively to put into the business. So he is now behind the business, but the business is trading as a separate legal personality funded in the way I've just discussed. The chap who made the loan, the debenture, to the £10,000 into the business, was hoping to make some money out of it, make some profit, as you do. But sadly, the business gets into trouble. He's loaned it that money. He's thinking, I want the cash back. So he looks at the business, and the business is looking a bit of a wreck. But he notices Mr. Sal and his family are all sitting pretty there, having secured their loans on the business. They seem to still have plenty of cash, so in an attempt to get his £10,000 back, he wants to go and pursue Sal. He wants to go behind the business and get some money back from the guy who set the business up. But the law won't let him do that. In fact, the law says no. The legal personality was Sal's Shoes Limited. That's gone bankrupt. Your money's gone with that. You cannot look behind the veil. So the corporate veil, actually, there's only circumstances in which he would be allowed to go after Sal and his personal wealth, was if the company had been set up as a sham, which it wasn't, if he'd been trading fraudulently or trying to evade paying his proper taxes, then the law would allow you to look behind the company. But in normal circumstances, once you've set up a legal personality, so long as it's a genuine business operating honestly, then you can't go and pursue the directors behind them or the shareholders for their personal wealth and contribution. So you might think, why wouldn't you always go for this option where you're protected, where you can have your assets behind the business and out of sight from potential creditors? So if you don't want to lay yourself open to losing all your personal money, you might think, well, I must set up a company and give myself that protection. And the creditors can't come after you. So you can hide behind the business. They can only see the business, they can't see you. And that is the rule. But of course, if you're doing it unethically, if you're doing it for a reason that's dishonest, the law won't tolerate that. And the law, they'll remove that, like that separate, limited liability if you're doing something dodgy. Okay, so there we are, the 4 basic business structures. You need to know the basics of them. You need to know where they sit with respect to liability. Know that the law gives you protection, but it's not completely hoodwinked. If you're behaving fraudulently or in a dishonest way, then you can't artificially create the protection of a limited company. Good. Okay, there's some extra materials with the essay answers, the exam answers that we looked at in the lecture, and again you'll find some more explanation of how you might expand your understanding of the business structures if you're interested. Thanks very much.